Hello, everyone. I'm guest host Zoe Russell here with Michael Boldin. Our topic today is Nullify Now, Why We the People Cannot Trust the Federal Government to Police Itself. We were just talking about Obamacare. You know, I read a blog post on the 10th Amendment Center blog by Leslie Swan of the Tennessee 10th Amendment Center, and she wrote that our options against Obamacare include pursuing lawsuits in federal courts, which she had just mentioned, interstate compacts, or nullification. I don't know if I've ever heard of interstate compacts. Can you tell us what those are?
Interstate compacts seem to be getting a lot of attention from the mainstream right. So I guess if someone like Fred Barnes is talking about it glowingly in the Weekly Standard, that would be a first red flag that it's probably not a good idea. These guys led people down the wrong path for 8 years under Bush, so I don't know how trustworthy they are. Constitutionally speaking, states can make agreements with each other. They can say, okay, we're going to deal with whatever issue, health care, for example. We're going to create our own health care setup. Maybe they'll create their own regulations. But Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution authorizes this. But the problem dealing with Obamacare in such a way, and this is how the Republicans are pushing, is that you can't have an interstate compact without the approval of Congress. Article 1, Section 10 says no state shall enter into an agreement or compact with each other without the approval of Congress. So it's unusual to me to consider an idea to reject national health care, trying to get approval from Congress when Congress gave it to us. It almost seems like a distraction and a waste of time, and maybe an effort to try to keep the top-down structure in place that we've had that's been failing for so long. I don't think either political party in Washington, D.C. has any interest in seeing a revival and a growth of nullification efforts where people in their own states just stop paying attention to what Washington, D.C. slams down our throats. So I think they want us to look at other things and keep our mind off the right solutions.
Right. I know that Ms. Leslie Swan in the article says it all boils down to one question. Do we ask permission from the federal government to undo Obamacare or simply undo it? It's like asking for a right that you already have.
Sure, and I think it doesn't hurt to look to the founders themselves for advice. And Thomas Jefferson, and I think you're in pretty good company if you go with his advice. All the founders obviously didn't agree on everything, but Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, had another declaration called the Kentucky Resolutions in 1798, and this was in response to a law that basically criminalized free speech, a horrid law that came out in the early days of the American Republic. And he said, quote, whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So what he's saying is, any time the federal government exercised powers that we did not give to it, a nullification, that's states resisting it, is not just a good idea. It's not something we're supposed to try after we vote the bums out and go to court or try compacts or whatever else may be some other plan. Jefferson says it is the rightful remedy every single time. So we're not supposed to sit and wait 2 or 4 or 6 years for a lawsuit to go through the Supreme Court. We're not supposed to wait 2 or 4 years for some elections or for some compact plan. We're supposed to resist and say no to every single violation of the Constitution as it happens in our states.
I think that would probably surprise Walter Dellinger. I grabbed a quote off of an NPR article. He's the former Clinton administration Solicitor General and a constitutional scholar who says of Virginia's Health Care Freedom Act, that would mean any state could pass any statute declaring any federal law invalid in that state and then bring a lawsuit to challenge the federal law, even though it has no federal stake or no obligation under that law. It just can't work like that. Are these the same reactions you get during interviews with the mainstream media?
Well, I generally bring up issues that the mainstream media is very interested in. I say, well, do you propose that we start arresting hundreds of thousands of people in California for using marijuana? And no one will ever say yes to that. They'll say, well, okay, maybe I don't like it here, but we'll let California do what they want to do. And I say, well, this is the same principle. They're ignoring federal law. They're ignoring the Supreme Court. And the sky is not falling. Things are not chaotic because some Californians decide to use marijuana for a tumor or whatever it may be. And it's the same principle, whether it's the Healthcare Freedom Act or medical marijuana laws. And when you present it to people in that type of a way and you understand where they're coming from, they tend to be a little bit more those types of issues. They'll often attack and say, oh, well, if states just start saying no, we'll have anarchy. Well, anarchy, absence of the rule of law, to me is what happens right now. There is no rule of law because the federal government never follows it.
Right. I have a great phrase from Tom Woods that at the very least, even if you're not, a strict adherent to the Constitution in terms of being a libertarian or along those lines, you can at least use it as a rhetorical bludgeon, he says, saying to the government, well, you use this as a legitimacy for your very existence. Couldn't you at least do what you wrote down?
Sure. And, well, I think we more use it as a guideline for the people. I spend less and less time paying attention to the federal government other than knowing what I need to just reject or work with other people to reject. And I believe that if we start looking to the inside, to our own communities, to our own cities, to our own states, and we fight out our political battles on a local level, we're going to have a much better place. Right.
We saw with Obamacare that we're clearly not reaching them at the federal level. If we had the same, for example, number of House of Representatives as people did way back when, and that it grew with the population up to 435, and then it was capped, we'd have, Tom Woods says, 10,300 representatives in the House.
That how high? Wow.
Right. They'd be a little bit easier to reach than the 435 that we have right now.
Sure, they're shielded. They don't work for the people, and they haven't for a long, long time, if they ever really did. And the only government that's worthwhile to deal with is the one that's local. And even where I live in California, I would rather the government just collapse here. I know I have a better shot of dealing with someone in the California state government than someone like Nancy Pelosi or Barbara Boxer.
Right. They've just got such great egos. We've always been taught to look to your federal government to solve every issue, never look to the local government. Moving on to some more initiatives, I'm a gun owner, and I'm very interested in the Firearms Freedom Act. Can you tell us about this initiative?
This is a really, really important bill that's been going around for a couple of years. It first was drafted by our friend Gary Marbut up in Montana and was passed there and then in Tennessee, and I believe it's 9 states total now. And this one deals with the Commerce Clause distortions that we were talking about previously, where the federal government claims that they can control, ban, prohibit everything under the Interstate Commerce Clause. And the Firearms Freedom Act says, just in short, it says that if a gun is made in state and it's sold in state and maintained in state, then the federal government can't control it as if it's interstate commerce. So we're rejecting federal laws that apply under interstate commerce. It doesn't deal with all firearms laws, but it's a very good step in the right direction. And a number of states have passed these. Wyoming was a very interesting one. They added penalties for any federal agent violating the Firearms Freedom Act. So if an ATF agent violated the Firearms Freedom Act in Wyoming, I believe it's like a $500 fine or something like that. I haven't seen where that's progressed since it passed, but this is a really good concept. We have a bill called the Intrastate Commerce Act that takes the Firearms Freedom Act that's been very popular to a whole nother level. It says that any product made, produced, grown, or any services done in state, as long as they're sold, and retained in the state are outside the purview of the federal government. They cannot control it. They cannot regulate it. They cannot prohibit. They cannot ban it. It's already been introduced in Virginia. We expect to see it in about another half dozen states. And I think this is really going to get the word out that there's nothing that the federal government should touch if it's produced and sold in your state. It could be wheat. It could be food. It could be marijuana. It could be a gun. It could be a health care plan. But get the federal government out of it.
Right, and I want to remind everyone or point everyone to the 10th Amendment Center website, 10thamendmentcenter.com, with TENTH spelled out, for example legislation that you can download and send off to your representative in your state. So let's just go on to another awesome initiative as minor economist. I really like the initiative in Georgia pertaining to one of the federal government's main sources of control, which is paper money. So what does the Constitutional Tender Law do?
Oh, this is a fantastic one. It's one of my favorites. In Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, it says, in essence, that no state can make anything but gold and silver coin a tender for payments of debts. Well, federal legal tender laws have been blocking that and violating the Constitution for a long, long time. And introduced in Georgia, and we expect to see it introduced also in Utah. We've got confirmation it will be introduced in Utah in the next couple of weeks, is the Constitutional Tender Act, or for example, in Utah, the Utah Sound Money Act. And it's just saying that in the state we're going to nullify those federal legal tender laws, and we're going to require that debts payable in the state are authorized to be paid in gold and silver coins. The idea is that it creates a competing currency, and if we understand the idea of a reverse Gresham's law, that this good money can drive out the bad, because especially as it grows in value, more and more people are going to want to use it. They're not saying this. The interesting thing about this, they're not saying that the states are going to start coining their own money, because then you get into all kinds of other constitutional conflicts. They're just going to use existing American Eagles, silver and gold, that are already in production, people already have, they're growing in value, and people can use them at at actual bullion value. So you have a $1,400 gold piece, it's worth $1,400, not the $50 that the federal government tries to kill it at.
Right, $1,400 today.
Is that what it is?
$1,500 tomorrow. No,
I'm just saying. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. So, have you seen any movement to counter this recent Food Safety and Modernization Act?
Well, what we've actually been recommending is that bill that I had mentioned, the Intrastate Commerce Act, because it says that any product grown, made, produced, built in state. So if we're talking about the Food, quote, Safety Act, this is dealing with people who are growing their own foods, local commerce. So if you're saying that any product grown, that could be a radish, it could be a tomato, it could be a hemp plant, any product made, it could be a gun. So this is the one that we really think should go right at that, because it goes to the core and it deals with so many other things at the same time. And that's on our website, 10thamendmentcenter.com. Under model legislation, you'd see the Intrastate Commerce Act.
Okay. So I've seen 10th Amendment resolutions and 10th Amendment bills. Can you tell us the difference between those two?
10th Amendment resolutions were very popular starting in 2008. These are non-binding statements issued by state legislatures that say, federal government, you're only authorized to exercise these powers, and we're demanding that you stop or else. Well, a lot of people will say, well, that does nothing. What's the point? The reality is, if you owned an apartment complex and I was your tenant and I didn't pay, you wouldn't just show up with an empty truck and say, all right, Michael, you're a bum, load up, we're out of here. You'd have to post notice and say, pay your rent or get out. It's serving notice. In fact, these 10th Amendment resolutions, there's actually another one still introduced for 2011 there in Texas, and a number of other states are already going to be doing it still. It's serving notice. It says that in the resolutions. We're serving notice and demand of the federal government to cease and desist, effective immediately, all undelegated powers. The question is, are the politicians doing that grandstanding or not? The ones who never do anything beyond passing a resolution, it's clear to me that they're just grandstanding and using popular support for the Constitution to do something that has no value. But if they do what they're supposed to do, like good people like Charles Key in Oklahoma or Matt Shea up in Washington State, they issue a resolution and then they follow up with a Firearms Freedom Act or an Intrastate Commerce Act or a Healthcare Nullification Act, because that's the or else. They're serving notice, and then they're saying, obviously the federal government isn't responding to that, but they're following a proper, I think, logical step. It gets the issue out for public discussion, and then they take the next step by saying, well, we're going to pass a binding law that rejects something specifically from the federal government.
So I've heard talk of a repeal amendment to the Constitution where any federal law could be repealed by a two-thirds majority of state legislatures. Do you see this as states sort of going to the federal government for rights that they already have?
Well, yes and no. I wouldn't say that a state should actually nullify powers that were delegated to the federal government. Like, a state shouldn't start kicking out all the U.S. Postal Service workers in the state. It's a pretty, I mean, if you compare it to all the other things the federal government does, that's pretty mundane.
Yeah.
So I don't think states should do that. The problem with the repeal amendment, there's two main ones. One, you're having, well, I guess maybe three, you're having to get basically a consensus amongst states to come up with some project to add an amendment to the Constitution, to change the Constitution, to add this new power. Well, I believe that whether one state or all 50 states feels that their liberties are being trampled on, they should reject them. So even if someone was alone, and sometimes being alone means you're the most right, popular opinion isn't always what's right. So sometimes if the federal government's doing something wrong and only one state's standing up for it, that doesn't mean it's wrong. It should still do what it feels is right. So, and the other problem is that it's actually authorizing states to reject any law, even those that are done under the enumerated powers that the federal government should be involved in. So they could pass a law about the post office, and maybe all the states are saying, no, we're not going to do it. Or maybe, for example, Ron Paul's Audit the Fed bill actually goes through this year. Well, if enough states say, well, we don't want that, then it's going to be gone. So it's a real double-edged sword. I think it's so unlikely to get even a constitutional president. How are we going to get two-thirds or three-fourths of the states to agree on one strict Constitution-style amendment? I don't know if that's the best use of people's resources.
Right. It's almost like if it is unconstitutional, you do already have the right. So is that not
you should just say no to it as it is. We've seen examples with medical marijuana and Real ID that when one state starts it, then other guys start getting the idea, well, this is a good idea. I should do it here in my state too, and then it actually works. So why do we have to try to reinvent the wheel?
We're about to go to another break, and we'll be back for our final segment with Michael Boldin. And we're back, Radio Free Market, with guest host Zoe Russell. I'm here with Michael Boldin of the 10th Amendment Center. Michael, why do you think that state governments are so hesitant to nullify federal laws in general?
Well, I think people in general are hesitant because a lot of people really just aren't educated that they can do it. If you would have talked to someone about this 3 years ago, they would have said you were absolutely nuts. But at least now we can actually have a conversation. You hear the word nullification come up in mainstream media from time to time, albeit generally it's pretty negative. But if they're attacking it, if you're catching flack, you've got to be over the target. So it's getting out there into the public sphere. A lot of people in the grassroots are wanting their states to stand up, and it's going to take a lot of pressure. Politicians don't like sticking their necks out. They get money, they get handouts. They don't want to do something. It takes a lot of pressure from the grassroots to give these guys some backbone in state legislatures. But a number of them are developing backbone, and some of them are actually good people. They're good people with very, tough lives. They work for a living, and they do this legislating thing as a part-time thing. So there are some good people on the state and local level that are actually standing up and saying no. And we've seen some examples already, and we expect to see many more in the 2011 legislative session.
All right. people are talking about nullification, and people are talking about the Federal Reserve, and we're starting to see that the emperor has no clothes. So what would you say that the reaction so far of the federal government has shown us about the power of the governed?
Well, I think they have complete disdain for their subjects. They don't really care what we want to do, but they really want to stay in power, and the Real ID Act shows that. They could have tried to twist everyone's arms and maybe send some tanks into Missouri for rejecting the Real ID Act, but they have to slowly and quietly as they can, back off when enough people say no. And so we are very encouraged by that reality, and we keep presenting it to more and more people, and they're seeing that and demanding that their own representatives in their own states do the same thing.
So tell us about this Nullify Now tour. I went to the tour in Fort Worth, and I personally thought it was awesome. I had such a great time. Tom Woods was a great speaker. You were a great speaker. So what's lined up for this second half of the tour?
Thanks, Zoe. We actually had 3 events in 2010 just to get the ball rolling there in Fort Worth. We also were in Orlando, Florida, and then in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we're kicking off 2011 in states' rights hotbed, Phoenix, Arizona on January 29th. We'll be in Cincinnati, Manchester, New Hampshire, the Twin Cities in Minnesota, Austin, Texas, out to Los Angeles, and we're adding more and more dates and more cities. People can get info on that tour, and also if they're interested in helping us bring dates close to them, they can go to nullifynow.com and get all the details. We're basically trying to educate people on these principles and not just give them information to learn things, but how they can actually put them into practice, what they can do. We invite state reps to come out. A number of them do in each city, and then we press them to actually take action in the State House.
Mm-hmm. I remember leaving thinking, whoa, I have so much more power than I thought. Let's bring it local. I guess I just hadn't thought about it in that sense before. So I think your movement is really helping to change people's mindset. And we didn't even touch on several other initiatives going on, like Defend the Guard, Cap and Trade EPA initiatives, the Sheriff's First legislation. So I just want to tell everyone to go ahead and go to 10thamendmentcenter.com and check all those out. I just really want to thank you for the Nullify Now speaking tour and for all that you do. I want everyone to go online and find legislation for your state reps. You can go to the 10th Amendment Center for adherence to the Constitution on every issue, every time, no exceptions, no excuses, and I want to thank you for that. So this has been Radio Free Market. I'm Zoe Russell. You can visit us on the web at radiofreemarket.com, and you can subscribe to all of our shows on iTunes or download all of our archives for free. So until next week, wherever you are, please stand up for freedom. Thank you for listening.